Something is happening to Joel Osteen, and the people who've watched him for 26 years can feel it. It showed up last year, mid-sermon, in front of 16,000 people. He stopped talking, looked out at the crowd longer than he ever does, and said something that wasn't in his notes. That sometimes life still hits you hard even when you do everything right. The smile snapped back, the applause came in, the cameras kept rolling. But that 1 second, where the producer slipped and the man underneath showed his face, was the realest moment Joel Osteen has had on stage in over a decade. Because behind that smile, the empire is cracking. Donations are slipping, his own church is now the site of a shooting, and the man America once called the happiest pastor looks very tired. So how did the most watched preacher on earth end up here? It started in August of 2017, and it came in the form of a hurricane. Hurricane Harvey hit Houston harder than anything the city had seen in decades. By the time the rain finally stopped, more than 100 people were dead. A third of America's fourth largest city was underwater, and the damage was climbing past $125 billion. You've probably seen the photos. Families stranded on rooftops. Babies being passed hand to hand across flooded streets. People sitting on overpasses watching their entire lives float away. And right in the middle of it all, near downtown, sat Lakewood Church. 16,000 seats. The single biggest indoor space for miles in any direction. And it stayed closed for days. The internet did not let that go. The hashtag #OpenLakewood started trending worldwide, and photos started circulating that showed dry streets and empty parking lots all around the church. Lakewood kept offering explanations. The building was flooded. They didn't have the staff. They were waiting for other shelters to fill up first. And nobody bought a single one of those excuses. Joel eventually tweeted that the doors were open, but by that point the damage was already done. The story wasn't about the hurricane anymore. It was about the church that wouldn't open. And then he made it worse. His first sermon after the storm, he stood up in front of a congregation full of people who had lost everything and told them to drop what he called their poor old me mentality. The words landed exactly the way that you'd expect them to land. People sleeping in shelters didn't want to hear about a victim mindset from a pastor whose mansion had stayed perfectly dry through the entire thing. That was the moment something broke. It wasn't the building, it was trust. Then 2020 rolled around, and the pandemic rolled with it. Small businesses were collapsing everywhere, and the federal government rolled out the Paycheck Protection Program to try to keep them alive. Emergency money went for the people who would otherwise lose everything. Lakewood Church, sitting on a $90 million annual budget with a multi-million-dollar pastor at the top, quietly took $4.4 million of it. And the backlash hit fast. The church returned the funds eventually, but the optics were already locked in. People had now seen, in two completely different situations, what Lakewood looked like when ordinary folks needed help, and what Lakewood looked like when there was money sitting on the table. Then there was the wealth itself. The mansion in River Oaks, 17,000 square feet, valued at $10.5 million. And then a second property worth roughly $3 million on top of that. He bought the second one while the criticism over the first was still active. Every time someone asked him about it, he landed in the same place. God wants his children blessed, not burdened. To his fans, that was faith. To his critics, it sounded like a line that he had been rehearsing for 20 years. But the number that really haunted every conversation about Lakewood was one that was entirely different. Reports kept coming out that roughly 100% of the church's annual budget was actually going towards outreach or charity. The other 99%, tens of millions of dollars a year, reports kept coming out that roughly 1% of the church's annual budget was actually going towards outreach or charity. The other 99%, tens of millions of dollars a year, was going into media production, the weekly services, and the administration. And the wild part is, this pattern just kept repeating. When Hurricane Beryl tore through Houston in 2024, Lakewood actually moved fast that time. They handed out food and water almost immediately, but it didn't matter. People online still ask the same question that they'd been asking since 2017. Why does it always take a storm to get those doors open? The optics from Harvey weren't just bad PR, they had become permanent. Once the public decides what your delay means, you can't undo it with a faster reaction the next time around. There's a specific kind of silence that destroys a public figure faster than any scandal. It's the silence between the moment the world asks for something and the moment you finally give it. Joel had mastered the smile. He really had never mastered the timing. Hurricane Harvey was the first time the public realized that the smile had a delay built into it. And once they saw the delay, they couldn't stop seeing it. But none of it, not the hurricane, not the loans, not the mansion, none of it prepared anyone for what walked through the doors of Lakewood Church in February of 2024. A woman named Genesee Yvonne Moreno walked into Lakewood carrying an AR-15. She brought her 7-year-old son with her. She told people she had a bomb. And within minutes, gunfire was echoing through hallways that had been built specifically to feel safe. A 47-year-old man was shot. Police returned fire. Moreno was killed in the exchange, and her son, who had absolutely no choice in any of this, was hit in the head. He survived after multiple surgeries, but he did survive. But his life will never be what it was before that Sunday. Investigators later found that Moreno had a long history of mental illness, prior threats already on the record, and a weapon she had purchased completely legally. There were warnings everywhere. Nobody had acted on any of them. The investigation that followed lasted more than a year. They found gaps in security, warnings that had been ignored, a system completely unprepared for what happened that day. And in the months that followed, even longtime members of the congregation started asking harder questions about leadership and accountability than they ever had before. The next Sunday, Joel addressed his congregation. His tone was the same it always was: calm, steady, familiar. He prayed for the victims. He prayed for the shooter's family. He prayed for peace. And then he moved on. No mention of what had failed. No reckoning with the security gaps. No real acknowledgement of what it actually means for a child to be shot inside a sanctuary. Just hope. Just the message. For the first time in his career, calm didn't read as strength. It read as detachment. And here's something worth sitting with. A church becomes a sanctuary because of what people believe happens inside it, not what actually happens inside it. The moment that belief gets broken, the building changes, even if every brick stays in place. February 11th, 2024 didn't just hurt Lakewood, it rewrote what Lakewood meant. And no sermon can rewrite something like that twice. The cracks deepened from there. Younger generations had already been drifting. Recent surveys put Gen Z and millennial church attendance at the lowest levels in American history, somewhere around 15 to 16% regularly attending. They didn't want what their parents wanted. They wanted pastors who talked about injustice, war, the economy, the violence inside Lakewood itself. Joel kept talking about positivity. The disconnect became its own quiet crisis. Insiders started saying something that shifted backstage. The energy wasn't the same. Volunteer turnover was up. There had been quiet cutbacks. The applause inside the building still sounded the same on television, but the people in the room said it didn't feel the same anymore. Which brings us to the part of the story almost nobody ever talks about. Because to understand why Joel Osteen reacts to everything the exact same way, to a hurricane, to a pandemic, to a shooting, you have to understand who Joel Osteen actually was before any of you ever heard his name. Here's a fact that almost nobody knows about Joel Osteen. For 17 years, before he ever stepped on stage as a pastor, his only job at Lakewood Church was running the cameras. For 17 years, his father, John Osteen, was the preacher. Joel was the kid in the production booth obsessing over the lighting, the angles, the sound mix, the timing of every shot. When his father asked him to step up and preach, Joel said no every single time. He had one job in his own mind: make dad look good on TV. Think about how strange that actually is. 6 kids in a preacher's family, and 5 of them naturally gravitated towards the pulpit. The choir, the singing, the speaking in front of the room. Joel was the only one who didn't. He went the opposite direction. He hid behind the camera, and he stayed there for almost 2 decades. The only reason he ever stepped in front of one was that his father asked him to one Sunday, and then was gone 6 days later, taken by a heart attack nobody saw coming. So think about that for a second. The first sermon Joel Osteen ever delivered became his father's last memory. And overnight, the camera operator became the pastor. Now think about what that actually means. Joel had never spent a single day training to be a preacher. Not one. He had spent 17 years training to make a preacher look good on camera. So when he stepped onto that stage in 1999, he wasn't preaching the gospel. He was doing the only thing he actually knew how to do. He was producing a show. And once you see that, every single thing about the next 26 years starts making sense. The sermons that always run 30 minutes and never an hour. The lighting that never changes. The smile that never breaks. The message that's always positive, always uplifting, always, and this is the key word, always televisable. Joel didn't build a church that happened to be on TV. He built a TV show that happened to call itself a church. And that's why his message has no fire in it. No brimstone, no hard talk about sin, because none of that plays well to a broadcast meant to reach 10 million American living rooms every week. Look at the church itself. In 2003, Lakewood signed a 30-year lease on the old Compaq Center, the basketball arena where the Houston Rockets used to play. $12 million for the lease. Another $95 million to renovate it. They added floors, broadcast studios, classrooms. When the doors opened in July of 2005, what walked into that building wasn't really a congregation. It was a studio audience. 16,000 people in person and millions more watching the broadcast that night. And that's the move that gives the whole thing away. No traditional pastor takes a basketball arena and turns it into a sanctuary. A producer does. A producer sees a room with perfect sight lines, great acoustics, and built-in camera positions, and he sees a permanent set. By 2010, his show was reaching 92% of American households. Your Best Life Now sold over 4 million copies. The Night of Hope tour was selling out Madison Square Garden 7 times over. He was filling Wembley Arena at London. His personal net worth climbed past $50 million, with some estimates putting it well past 100. In a country starving for good news, the formula worked better than anyone could have imagined. But here's the problem with running a TV show for 26 years. Eventually, life gives the world a reason to want something other than good news. And when that moment comes, the man on the show has to decide if he can change the script. Joel Osteen never figured out how to change the script. Which brings us back all the way to the moment that we opened with. That pause during last year's sermon. The line wasn't in his notes. The smile that dropped for a single breath before snapping back into place. The applause came back, the cameras kept rolling, but the people who know him best say that the pause was the real sermon that day, because for 1 second, the producer slipped, and the man underneath showed his face. Here's the trap nobody talks about. A brand built on perfection cannot survive admitting imperfection. If Joel Osteen stood up next Sunday and confessed real doubt, real fear, real questions, the underneath structure beneath him would collapse. The donations, the book sales, the entire identity. All of it depends on the smile staying intact. That smile is no longer a shield, it's a cage. Some pastors have tried to reinvent themselves in moments like this. They lean into vulnerability. They confess things. They let the audience finally see them as human. But for Joel Osteen, that move is almost impossible at this point. His entire identity is built on being unbroken. The smile is the brand. Take the smile away, and there's no brand left to fall back on. And his strength was always control over his image, his words, his tone. But control has a cost. When racial unrest tore through American cities, Joel said almost nothing. When wars broke out, he said nothing. When the economy crushed his own congregants, he said nothing political, nothing pointed, and nothing real. He calls it spiritual focus. Critics call it cowardice. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But in 2026, silence on everything that actually hurts people doesn't read as neutrality anymore. It reads as absence. So when you put all of this together, the 17 years behind the camera, the 26 years in front of it, what you're really looking at is a man who has been producing the exact same show for almost his entire adult life. First with his father as the star, then with himself. It's the same set, the same smile, and the same script. The lighting has changed a bit. Hope was always the product. The pastor was always the actor. And the smile, that famous unbreakable smile, it was never about faith. It was about perfect lighting. He learned that on day one, and he's still doing it 26 years later. The only difference is the camera finally turned on him. Whether Lakewood survives, whether his son inherits the empire, whether the message can outlast the man, none of that has been written yet. The mansion still gleams, the books still sell. Every Sunday the lights still come on, and Joel Osteen still stands at the pulpit and tells the world that their best days are still ahead of them. He may even believe it. He may have to. But for the first time in his entire ministry, the man who built a church on telling people things would be okay looks like he knows the ending may not be the one he's been promising. And maybe that's the loneliest part of the whole story. Because somewhere underneath the lighting, the brand, everything that goes with the church, there is a man. There has to be. We just haven't seen him in 26 years.